Hello everybody, time for another Total War Wainriders preview, the mod being developed for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion. We're taking a look today in particular at the menu screens. We'll look at the main menu here, the single player campaign, and then the faction selection screen. There's some beautiful looking stuff here, and I kind of want to go through it and give some credit to the people who have been working so hard on this. I have to say, although I was part of the development team for 4th Age Total War, and I saw how hard those guys worked. This is just bringing it to a completely different level with Wainriders. I've never worked with another group of people who have found so many things to do. When I would have said, yeah, that looks fine, and just sort of gotten on with my life, Valor, Eridan, Weba have just found things to improve consistently, trying to make things look better, make things work better in the mod. So it's just really, really fantastic to be working with those guys on this project, or at least observing them work on this project. I just sort of fiddle around with the words every now and then. But at any rate, we're going to look at the menu screens here. And this first one is a really interesting option. And I would never have come up with this. I believe this is Valor's concept here, to show the Argonath from the outsider's perspective. Valor, I think, will not deny that he is something of a Dunedain sympathizer. I'm just going to put it out there. I'm more of an Easterling guy myself, as you might be able to tell from the direction of the mod here. But Valor likes the Dunedain, and so when he first floated the idea of the Argonath being in here, I thought, well, this isn't a mod about Gondor, but of course it is, right? Gondor is suffering under the invasion of the Wainriders, and so having this symbol here is kind of nice because it puts me in the position of maybe a scouting raft of the Easterlings who are heading downriver and seeing these colossal stone statues of the kings, indicating that they need to keep out. So at any rate, we've got this wonderful menu screen here. Now, I should say that as we go through these menus, given the incredibly nitpicky nature of the modding team, I don't think they'll mind me saying that, almost anything you see may be changed. They may find something to adjust, to tweak as we go on down the line. But I believe that this is looking just fantastic at this point. So they gave me the go-ahead to do a little preview for you today. Let's see what we have on the single-player screen here. Of course, you get your typical options: the Wainriders campaign, historical battle. I don't know that we're going to really have historical battles for this particular mod. Those take a while to put together. And I think it's sort of outside the scope of what we're planning currently. But of course, custom battles, these are the things that you've been seeing in the faction previews where we've looked at the units. So of course, you're going to have that. And over here, we've got some quotes. I believe this is from Unfinished Tales. It's either that or Appendix A at the end of Return of the King. In fact, it may be that, actually, now that I think about it. So this is the third evil was the invasion of the Wainriders. Stirred up, as was afterwards seen by the emissaries of Sauron, they made a sudden assault upon Gondor, and King Narmakil II was slain in battle with them beyond the Anduin in 1856. The people of eastern and southern Rhovanion were enslaved, and the frontiers of Gondor were for that time withdrawn to the Anduin and the Emyn Muil. And again, that makes the initial menu screen just make that much more sense, right? This is certainly the central drama that the mod focuses on. The third evil, by the way, is a reference to, well, the three evils that are mentioned, and I think it is in Appendix A. The first one being not the kinslaying, but it's the civil war, essentially, between the Dunedain following Eldacar and then Castamir, right? So that struggle. The second evil is the plague, and then a couple hundred years after that, we have the invasion of the Wainriders. So this provides a little bit of context, lore-based context for the mod. Let's plunge into the real meat of this video, and the thing that I am just so happy about. I have to say, for the longest time, my favorite faction selection menu of all time was 4th Age Total War. If you've ever played that mod, which I imagine almost all of you who are watching this video have, it's just a beautiful piece of work with the vines and branches indicating the relationships between the factions. So clearly a lot of thought, a lot of work went into that. But I don't know, the Wainriders one, I'm just in love with this thing. Let's take a look. Okay, so what we have here is a map of Middle-earth, and you select the faction symbol for the faction that you want to play. Currently, it's defaulting to the Woodland Realm. I am sure that we're going to switch that up at some point so that it's defaulting to maybe Gondor, maybe the Western Horde. So because it defaults to the Woodland Realm, it's hard to see exactly what this faction selection screen does. Let's click to Gondor and we'll show you that. Click your faction and it fills in the map with the starting territories. How awesome is this? First of all, I love the art style of the map here. This is something that, again, was being constantly worked on by Valor and Eradan as he added stuff to the campaign map, added features. And you may notice some differences between the topography of the 4th Age map and what you're seeing here as well. We filled in a few gaps, a few blank spaces on the map, I think in a fairly understated and respectful way that is certainly... You can't say that it has a strict basis in the writings or drawings of Tolkien, but it certainly is not unreasonable. And so there are some additions of hills, mountains, and rivers that are maybe hinted at in writings or sketches, but in any case, just a beautiful looking piece of art here. So let's go over the factions. I'm just very excited about this, partly because there's a very cool factor of seeing where you're going to control, but also the unit cards. Valor outdid himself here. He took the units that have been designed by Webba, of course, and put them in these crazy poses. Not all of them. Some of these units are going to be, a bit more straightforward in the unit card presentation, but this is a great one. So here we've got a Knight of Gondor spearing a Wainrider through the chest here. So very good stuff. But with Gondor, you have not only the Gondor proper region, you have what it would later become known as Rohan, right? You've got Calenardhon, and then you've got to the south still some possession of the Cape. I think they call it the Cape of Umbar. So you will start with Umbar at the beginning of the campaign. You will notice, however, that there are some factions poised nearby. So let's probably take a look at all of these and see the starting positions. Again, this may change, but the fact that we've gone ahead and included this stuff on the map for the faction selection screen is a pretty clear indication that we're fairly happy with the way things are now. So the Lordship of Umbar is the next faction we're going to look at. You'll notice that they have essentially just the coastline, just north of Umbar and a little bit of Harandor's coast, pretty much on either side of the Harnan River. They do not start with the city of Umbar at the beginning of the campaign. We wanted them to be around to sort of represent some disaffected Dunedainic nobles and what would eventually become, the feared corsairs of Umbar, later on in the Third Age. But from what we could tell, it seemed plausible that Gondor was still in possession of Umbar at this point in the campaign, and it also seemed more fun to have Gondor begin with this outpost, right, that's kind of surrounded by enemies. So the plan is for Umbar to be a relatively weak stronghold. I mean, it's going to be a certainly strong in terms of the walls, in terms of the development of the city, but it's not going to have the strongest garrison. Part of the theme of this mod in some ways is that Gondor and the Dunedain are just being constantly battered by these combined forces. Not only have they had to deal with this kin strife, not only have they had to deal with the plague, but now they're dealing with this concerted effort of Easterlings, of orcs, of other factions and mysterious forces coming against them. So in Gondor, you will feel like you're under siege is the plan. Umbar, though, is going to be a pretty challenging start as well, because they're going to have to compete not only with one of the largest factions on the map, but also an up-and-coming faction, the Tribes of Harad. This is going to be a different presentation of the Tribes of Harad from what you may remember from the Fourth Age Total War, or from indeed how they are depicted in a lot of other games, mods, and media. We're looking at a more skirmish-based, more lightly armed, more loosely organized faction here. They're called the Tribes of Harad, not the Empire of Harad, not the Kingdom of Harad, but they are this sort of coalition at this point. You'll notice that they occupy a pretty central position in the south, so they're going to comprise some Far Haradrian style units, some plainsmen types, and of course they will eventually get some access to Mumakil also. So between them and Umbar and Gondor, it's going to be an interesting battle for the south part of the map, at least the western part. Another faction, though, that we have classed as a Haradrian faction in terms of culture will be Khand. And this is another one of those fantastic unit cards here. We've got I think it's an Iron Tower Warrior is what we're calling these guys. And he's just about to batter a Gondor men-at-arms senseless right into the dust. Very, very good stuff here. Khand, we're imagining, if we're thinking of Harad as being a little less advanced than they appeared in the Fourth Age, Khand is going in the opposite direction. We're picturing a stronger Khand at this phase. And I think part of the reason for that is we do not have Sauron in Mordor, right? Like, Sauron is not here. Mordor is certainly a sort of a desolate, haunted place, right? It's not a place that Gondor is occupying in any great sense of the word, but neither is anybody else. And so the fact that Sauron is not here, able to exert his will directly over his neighbors in the east, means, in our opinion, that we could view Khand as having more power, more advanced civilizations, technology, society than they had in the past. So you're seeing some more heavily armed warriors potentially. You're certainly seeing an emphasis on cavalry, on ranged units, but you'll also see some stronger melee types, and so that's going to make them a pretty interesting faction. So in the south, we're seeing really a four-way battle between the last outpost of Gondor in the southern city of Umbar, the newly rising Lordship of Umbar along the coasts, the tribes of Harad in the south, and of course the chiefdom of Khand, to some extent the newcomers in the east. I also like to picture these guys as roughly analogous to the Hephthalites or the White Huns, who potentially came off map and maybe crossed some of those eastern mountains and descended upon this relatively empty land, maybe somewhat recently. Because this, it's maybe worth mentioning, around the period of the Wainrider invasions, I believe is the first time we hear any reference to Khand. We certainly hear of them in the later Third Age during the War of the Ring, but I don't believe they're referenced before the Wainriders invasion. So if that's the case, then we could certainly imagine them as being somewhat recent arrivals. Well, let's stick with the East for now, and we'll take a look at Great Rune. This is a faction we have not yet previewed, and so the units here are not totally finished. This is the one that we're still working on, and we'll bring you the final faction unit preview for that in a little while. So this unit card here, this is a holdover from Fourth Age Total War. We'll certainly change that as the chariot models and all the other units are, of course, being completely reworked. Great Rune, as you can see, though, occupies a larger position in some ways than it did as Rune in the Fourth Age. We're sort of seeing this as the more opulent, strong, centralized, city-based Easterling power. We have three Wainrider factions. We've got Great Rune, we've got the Western Horde over here, and then we've got the Highland Tribes. But really, Great Rune and the Western Horde are going to be the big bosses on the central and eastern parts of the map. And so we're hoping that Great Rune is going to be expanding both potentially towards Gondor, but also in the south. We know that Rune, or the Wainriders rather, as they're called in Unfinished Tales, the Eastern Wainriders, and Khand did face some conflict, and it seems as though the Wainriders had the better of it eventually, which led to their what seems to have been submission of Khand and an alliance. At least that's how I'm interpreting what we can see in the text. During that last great invasion of, I think, 1944, when they did kill a king of Gondor, but were themselves cast back ultimately at the Battle of the Camp. So we can stick with the Wainriders, I suppose, and take a look at the Western Horde. This is one of the factions we previewed fairly early. So again, you can find videos for all of the units and rosters and so on the channel. But the Western Horde is going to occupy Rovanion, essentially, or at least that part of Rovanion that we can assume they were lording it over. You'll notice that we did leave a channel down in the south, though, for Great Rune to potentially border Gondor and to sort of keep that conflict going. We imagine that the Western Horde and Great Rune are going to be allies, and because we're using the Alexander EXE, we can make that a pretty strong alliance without necessarily doing the same trick with super factions that was done in Fourth Age Total War. So in other words, they can go to war but it's unlikely that they will. In any case, the Western Horde is going to be a mix of Northmen units as well as Eastern units. And they're going to be basically right up against Gondor, right along the Anduin River. And so they're going to be in a really good position to push over into Calenardon and then potentially down into the stronger parts of Gondor, maybe in Ithilien. Of course, as they go further into the forested terrain, the rough terrain, their chariots and cavalry armies are going to have a tougher time. So it's potentially going to be a pretty interesting show-off, or standoff, rather, between these two factions. Let's take a look at the third Wainrider faction, the Highland Tribes, another great unit card from Valor here. This is a horse archer unit shooting a Wainrider in the back. And so we imagine there's going to be some conflict between the Highland Tribes and the other Wainrider factions. These are the guys we're picturing heading up into the Highlands to flee from the growing power of Great Rune and the other Wainriders. And so as they go up into the north, they encounter some dwarves, maybe some exiled clans, and then they make that alliance there that we've discussed in the faction preview videos. So this is going to be a faction like Khand, where you will have a choice of sort of how to develop. Do you want to embrace the dark side, so to speak, and your sort of native traditions, or do you want to maybe go along with some different approaches? And that will reflect different types of units that you can train, essentially. Right near the Highland Tribes, we have an elven faction, the Avari. We have seen them in other videos, of course, and they have an interesting position here, right around the Sea of Rune, including, as you might be able to tell here, the island of Tol Rune. So I think they're going to start with maybe 3 settlements initially. It'll be a very tricky start because this is going to be a faction that gets some advantages in the forests, and the forests will be certainly all around their homeland, but outside of it, that territory, it's going to be more open, and so they'll be more susceptible to the chariots and cavalry of their neighbors. It may be that they come into conflict early with the Highland Tribes, maybe with Great Rune, but probably a good move for the Avari is going to be expanding west up the rivers and maybe even into Mirkwood. That's what I would do. My dream playing the Avari is to overthrow Thranduil and sort of take over northern Mirkwood. It's, of course, a little ridiculous, but it seems like a fun challenge to try. Also in the north, we have the League of the North. This is another dwarven faction, but it has some Mannish units. So this is going to comprise the territories of what would later become Dale, as well as the Iron Hills, Erebor, and maybe some surrounding villages. It's going to be sort of a well-defended starting position, but right to your south, you're going to have the Western Horde. So there will be a little bit of rebels or independent settlements that you'll maybe be able to snap up before you come into contact with this faction. Then the other great expansion that you may have to worry about is the Highland Tribes. They'll be probably going for the Iron Hills because the dwarves that are working with the Highland Tribes will certainly want to take advantage of that territory as well. So it's going to be some interesting conflicts up here in the north, not really like anything that we've seen in the Fourth Age, I think. We, of course, have Thranduil's realm here. It is very, very small. I think there's only 2 settlements that they'll have initially, maybe 3. But it's going to be essentially the Elven King's Halls and then 1 or 2 others along the fringes of that. Thranduil's realm is sort of tricky, and it was one of the factions I think that we added conceptually pretty late to the development of the mod, because we didn't want to lump them with all of the other elves, because it just didn't seem right. Thranduil was very isolated during this period. We don't hear of him doing anything, whereas we do hear of elves over in the west, Rivendell, from Lorien, from Lindon, fighting against Angmar. So it seemed appropriate to leave Thranduil in his own territory. And then the question arose of, well, what are you going to do if you're playing as Thranduil? Well, what I would do is head down the river and take over the famous wine trade of Dorwinion that Thranduil seemed to enjoy so much. Maybe conquer some Avari territory, who knows? That seems, again, a little bit out of character, but it's the kind of thing I enjoy. And then, you're also probably going to be fighting with the factions to your north, which are going to include the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. So this is very exciting, again, to have a pure orc faction. Fantastic. Unit card here, we've got a troll dangling a dwarf by the foot. So this Orcish faction is going to begin in an alliance with Angmar, as you might expect, but they're also going to be somewhat independent. So they're going to have their own territory pretty much north of Khazad-dûm, and also some territories in the south of the Grey Mountains as well. So you can expect Orcish units. You can expect to have a lot of numbers, but not a lot of quality until you get into the higher tiers of development, where you'll have some very interesting shock options like trolls, like the orc champion types and so on. So a pretty interesting faction to play as the pure sort of evil guys here. But I also like thinking of the orcs as being, you know, maybe a more independent, maybe the kind of faction that, yeah, is not the best morally speaking, but all they want to do is just, you know, hunt and pursue their own way of life and, you know, raid and pillage and stuff. They're not at this point under the direct control of Sauron, right? Because again, Sauron is in hiding at this point. But not in hiding is the Witch King of Angmar, and it'll be very exciting to play this faction too. You'll notice that Angmar controls a fairly large amount of territory, from territory abutting the Lossoth tribes to the north, as well as, you know, the parts of Rudar, going right up against Rivendell here, and also even crossing the Misty Mountains and controlling territory in the north of the Anduin, right at the mouths, or the sources rather, of the Anduin River. We know that Angmar did control some of this territory, at least at some point, because when the kingdom fell, one of the last parts to be destroyed or routed out was this portion, and we know that the oathiad went to the north and drove out the last remnants of the folk of Angmar. Not a lot is said in terms of specifics about who exactly makes up the people of Angmar, but we're imagining several different groups. There are, of course, going to be some orcs that you can train as part of this faction, some other nasty types. But in terms of men, we're looking at the hill folk, who would have been sort of native to this region, and some cultic type sorceress dudes who would have come in to support the Witch King. So this is going to be the primary antagonist in the north, and a big problem for lots of factions, including, by the way, the oathiad. The oathiad are very similar, of course, to the later folk of Rohan, but they comprise a few different groups. One of those groups is going to be refugees from Rovanion, the Northmen of Rovanion, after their lands were basically destroyed and subdued by the Wainriders. Many of them fled into the west and north along the middle reaches of the Anduin to establish a new realm there. They would later become the ancestors of the Rohirrim, of course. But we also imagine the oathiad will draw some influence from what would later become the Woodmen and the Beornings, because they're, of course, right in that territory. So the oathiad are going to have to deal with potentially Wainriders coming up the river or through the forest, as well as the orcs, who are going to be right near them, and Angmar as well. So there's going to be a lot of threats to deal with as the oathiad. And there's going to be a lot of potential directions you might go. You might, of course, head north initially to take on the might of Angmar, but you're going to be hard put to it, I think, to hold that territory against Angmar and the orcs. Or you could push south, but of course that's going to involve you in conflict with the Western Horde. Let's take a look at the High Elves. So we just previewed this faction on the video in the channel recently, and you can see here from the map that they are very, very far-flung indeed. Over in the west, they control the largest concentration of their territory. This is most likely where you're going to be training your Noldor, or at least most of them, but this is going to be probably the part of the map with a little bit more difficult population mechanics to manage. This is going to be also, however, one of the safer parts of the map. Angmar is a little bit, out of your reach initially. You've got the Kingdom of Orthodyne in between you and Angmar. But of course, you will want to help Orthodyne out, because we are going to set up the campaign in such a way that things will be likely very difficult for this faction. And so, especially if you're playing as the High Elves, you can expect your ally here, Orthodyne, to come under a lot of pressure. But yeah, let's take another look at Orthodyne. This is, I think, a much anticipated faction as well. And here we've got is this one of the bodyguard units? Potentially. You can see him leading a horse there. Very just innovative ideas for these unit cards. I love it. So Orthodyne is essentially the remnant of Arnor that is still around. You can see the territory that was also known as Rudar and Cardolan are not in its possession initially. It does begin in possession of the Shire, and so we've had a lot of discussions about how to represent that faction or that group of peoples within Orthodyne. I don't really want to get into that right now, but for the most part, you can expect a Dunedainic faction, and you can again look at the preview video for that if you want a closer look at the types of units you can expect for Orthodyne. But again, we're expecting a pretty difficult fight here. The general design principle is that Orthodyne is going to basically rely on smaller unit numbers, but more elite units. So it's going to be very much a defensive type of faction. There will be some other troop types from different sorts of populations, Cardalan, Rudar types. As you expand, the idea is that you will have access to different units that are maybe more numerous, more suited for different tasks, but not as elite and well-armed as your core roster. But for the most part, yeah, this will be a tough one. You'll be sort of on the back foot as Angmar, potentially the Orcs, and some other factions come up from the south to make life difficult for you. This is one of my favorite factions, and probably my favorite unit card here. The Black Forest Tribes. Here is a one of the elite axemen. I say elite, but I mean this is a tier 3 military development faction. They're not going to be super well armed, but this is one of your best units, hacking down a Dunedainic swordsman, desperately reaching for his blade on the grass. He won't be getting up again after that. The Black Forest Tribes are sort of a amalgamation of several different populations along the coastline, essentially. We do have references to a fairly numerous but barbarous fisher folk who live along the coast of Enedwaith, and we know that there were some people living in the depths of the Blackwood. So in any case, it's a group that we've imagined has sort of joined up together, and they're going to have a pretty interesting position, spanning the mouth of the Grey Flood all the way down to the mouth of the Eisen, and all the way up to the mouth of the Brandywine, I believe this is. And so, while you will not be neighboring anybody initially, you're not that far away from Orthodyne, right? Just across Sarn Ford. And you're not that far away from the chiefdom of the Angren either. This is going to be another middleman faction like the Black Forest Tribes, like the Oathiad, like the realm of Angmar, actually, where the bulk of the population we imagine is those hillmen. And so these middlemen factions have gotten a lot of attention and a lot of love over the course of the development here. A lot of that is the mental work of Weba84 coming up with different ideas with me for how we could imagine these groups of people. So the Black Forest Tribe is one of my favorites, but I know that there are some on the team who are really looking forward to the Chieftain of the Angren as well, as am I, to be honest. We're seeing here some of the more Dunedainic-inspired units of Tower Bowmen, I think they're called. And the idea behind this faction, of course, is that you control Isengard, essentially, or what would later become known as Isengard. Aglarond and Angrenost, those two fortresses are going to be under your control. You can see that the map, basically your area is going to be along the Eisen at its upper reaches and into what would later become known as, of course, the West March of Rohan. You're going to be initially allied with Gondor. As you can see, you do share some borders. But given that Gondor is going to come under pressure from the Wainriders and Harad, these other factions, there may be some opportunity for you as the Chieftain of the Angren to expand into that vacuum, to maybe help Gondor, help your allies against the Wainriders, maybe acquiring some territory for yourself in Calenhardon as part of the process, or potentially moving into the west. You'll notice that there's some fairly empty land here between you and the Black Forest Tribe, so it's going to be somewhat of a race between you two as to who commands what would later become Dunland and the lands south of the Eisen. I believe the only faction we haven't looked at yet is Durin's Folk. This is going to be, man, if you thought Thranduil was pretty isolated there, Durin's Folk, this is a faction that hasn't been seen or heard from for, like hundreds or thousands of years? I mean, pretty much since the Second Age, when Sauron came up here and laid waste to the territory. They shut the West Gate, and that was kind of it. They're going to control only the settlement of Khazad-dûm at the beginning of the campaign, and so, of course, they're going to be sworn enemies of the Orcs. Campaign goals for this faction are almost certainly going to involve heading up the Misty Mountains and grabbing all of these Orcish settlements, maybe even eliminating this faction ultimately. We're not quite sure about victory conditions just yet, but that might bring you into some conflict with the League of the North, who may be doing something similar as they capture dwarven or former dwarven territories in the Grey Mountains and move west as well. So with that, I think we've covered all of the factions. How did I neglect this? We've got a couple of... So this is indeed a dwarven faction, but we've got a couple of Northmen here sharing a pint. So this is a look at all the factions that we've got playable for Wainriders. I just love this map, the faction selection screen, the fact that you can look at the territory you're going to control and sort of plan out where you're going to go. We've got these descriptions here that will hopefully give you a good sense of the faction as well. Include some flavor text and so on to get you in the proper mood for playing the campaign. So stay tuned to the channel as we continue to bring you updates as the work goes apace with the development of Total War Wainriders. I can't wait to show you more stuff. In particular, we're going to be looking at Great Runes roster in a little while. Not quite sure when that's going to be ready yet, but when it is, you can rest assured we'll have that video out. Until the next one, take care.